So as Megan said, my name is Erin Roycroft. I'm the newest member of Tonkon's L&E group. I joined Tonkon during COVID. And so as I can imagine, most of you can relate. My life and my work feel that they've been totally dominated by COVID. A lot of the information I'm going to share with you today about mandatory vaccination policies comes from a combination of seminars that I've attended, my own research on the topic, and just generally being a person in the world who couldn't escape COVID news if I tried. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to address the current status of COVID-19 vaccines. We'll talk about the general rule, which I'm sure is the burning question for everyone here. Can I require my employees to get a shot? The answer is yes, but there's some really important exceptions that I'll address. And then we'll talk about risk. So even if you can require employees to get a shot, should you? We'll talk about some important considerations, including if you have a unionized workforce, also workers' comp considerations, and some other things, and preview some proposed legislation as well. So first of all, some of this information I'm about to give about available vaccines might seem basic, as we've all been living in the COVID reality for over a year, but because it forms the foundation for what I'm going to talk about later, I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So there are currently 3 vaccines that have been approved. The first is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. It's been approved for people who are 12 and older. It is a 2-shot vaccine. There's a 3-week waiting period between the shots. The second is the Moderna vaccine. It's currently approved for people who are 18 and older. It's also a 2-shot vaccine. The waiting period between the 2 doses is 4 weeks. And the third vaccine is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There's been a little bit of controversy around this vaccine, and some of its approval was paused due to concerns about blood clotting, but it's been re-administered in the state of Oregon, reapproved for administration. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is also, as is the Moderna, approved for people who are 18 and older. And the Johnson & Johnson is a single-dose vaccine. As Megan mentioned, one important thing to note is that in order for people to be fully vaccinated, the CDC does recommend a 2-week waiting period after receiving the shot, the second dose. And according to CDC recommendations, all of these vaccines are safe, effective, and reduce your risk of severe illness. The CDC does not recommend one brand of vaccine over another. But one important thing to note is that they are all currently approved by the FDA on an emergency use authorization only. I will spend more time discussing that later. So the good news is the vaccination rates are rising across the country. The percentages that you see here for Multnomah County, Oregon, and the United States as a whole is data that you can actually access yourself. The New York Times has an interactive vaccination data map that's by county. This data is for people ages 12 and up. Like I mentioned, because the vaccination has only been approved for people 12 and up recently, I think some of these numbers are potentially artificially low or lower than they would be if you were looking only at people who were 18 and older who've been able to be vaccinated for longer. I think if you look at people who are 18 and older, the numbers are more along the lines of around Multnomah County, I think it's in the low 60%. And then in Oregon and in the US, it's hovering around 50%. This is as of a couple of weeks ago, so things might have changed since then. You might have different numbers than I do. But this data shows there is still some vaccine hesitancy. That could be for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into. Here you'll see the daily administration of vaccination has peaked around April 5th. I think that was around the date that the vaccine was approved for everyone. And it's waned since then. So we've seen some drop off of daily administration of the vaccine. Some states have been getting really creative with incentivizing their citizens to continue to get the vaccine. In Oregon, there's a $1 million lottery. Somebody from each county will win $1 million. And I think you get automatically entered when you get vaccinated. And other creative programs, New York and Ohio are offering full scholarships for students who get vaccinated in the same lottery style. So now we'll talk about the burning question: can I require my employees to get a vaccination? Generally, the rule is yes. The EEOC earlier this year issued some guidance that said that it was not a violation of the ADA to require your employees to get vaccinated. They updated that guidance recently on May 28th. Their new guidance says much more clearly than their former guidance did, quote, "The federal EEO laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19, subject to the reasonable accommodations provisions of Title VII and the ADA and other EEO considerations." So the general rule is, yes, you can require your employees to get vaccinated. But there are some really important exceptions. First, for healthcare and emergency workers, and for people who have disabilities, and for sincerely held religious beliefs, each of which we will talk about in turn. So I will back up to the general rule. For anybody who is a healthcare or emergency response employer, the answer is actually no, you can't require your employees to get vaccinated. That's because of an Oregon statute. And I guess I should say that only applies for Oregon employers. The citation here, for anybody who's going to go home and do some legal research, the citation is actually wrong. So I think the actual statute is ORS 433.416 sub 3. But that Oregon statute states that a worker shall not be required as a condition of work to be immunized under this section unless otherwise required by federal or state law. The law also requires employers to provide the vaccination to their employees at no cost. Now, a worker under that section means, for example, a healthcare worker, a firefighter, a law enforcement officer, corrections officer, parole and probation officer. So it's not for every employer, just for healthcare and emergency response workers. That's not an exhaustive list of the type of workers that are covered under that statute. So if you think you might be covered, it's probably best to talk to an attorney about whether that's true if you're considering a mandatory vaccination policy. But for everybody else who's not a healthcare or emergency response employer, the general rule applies. The EEO guidance says employers may require proof of vaccination as long as they provide reasonable accommodation for disability and sincerely held religious beliefs. So we'll talk about each of those two accommodations in more detail. The first is considerations for disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, this might be a little bit basic, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because I know not everybody here is an employment lawyer. Generally, when an employee requests an accommodation because of a disability, it triggers the employer's duty to engage in the interactive process. The interactive process is essentially a conversation between the employee and the employer to find an accommodation that doesn't cause the employer undue hardship. Some examples of what a hypothetical accommodation could be, just off of the top of my head, could include potentially continuing to work from home, continuing to wear personal protective equipment, like Megan discussed, face masks or face shields, or perhaps there's a way to have an employee work in a modified workspace. Again, these are just hypotheticals. If you have an employee who can't get vaccinated because of a disability and you have questions about what an appropriate accommodation would be, you can always reach out to one of us, and we would be happy to help you work through that. Now, if you can't find an accommodation because of your workspace or the nature of the employee's work, there is a possibility that the direct threat exception from the ADA's usual anti-discrimination policy could apply, but it's really a very narrow path, and I would caution you to be very careful when deciding whether an employee who cannot get vaccinated because of a disability is posing a direct threat. So the definition of direct threat is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of that employee or others, which cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. When deciding if your employee is posing a direct threat, generally, you need to consider 4 factors. They're listed on the screen here: the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm would occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. Under those factors, the CDC and the EEOC has advised that employers who are considering, to identify an employee who can't get vaccinated because of a disability as a direct threat, to consider, in COVID specific terms, you have to consider the most recent medical knowledge. That includes community transmission rates, and the CDC's most recent statements about COVID and transmission. You also have to consider your particular work environment. That includes ventilation, how frequently does the employee interact with others, including other employees or members of the public where vaccination status isn't known. What's the availability at your workplace of screening tests? For instance, at my kids' daycare, they daily take our temperature and ask about COVID exposure. Is that something that you could do? And the availability of PPE, as we already discussed. So I think the takeaway with regard to direct threat is that it's a really delicate path. So you want to be very careful and probably consult with an attorney if that's something you're considering. And then I just wanted to briefly mention, I saw somebody had earlier, I think during Blorina's presentation, asked a question about keeping master lists of those who are vaccinated. And, to give a full answer, I'd want to give some more thought to that. But one thing I will flag in response to that question is that any information that you retain about an employee's vaccination status is medical information that is confidential, as Blorina and Megan had mentioned, and should be kept in the employee's medical file, not in a personnel file, because personnel file is not a confidential space. And lastly, I think this is just best practice. As Megan mentioned, communication is key. So I think if you're going to require your employees to get vaccinated, it's best practice to tell them up front that you will consider any requests for accommodations for disability and religious exemption, and let them know how to make those requests so that it's crystal clear. And so next we'll address the religious exemption, or the accommodation for religious belief. So under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, you have to make accommodations for employees who have sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, this could potentially raise 2 questions for you. The first that you may ask is, is it really a sincerely held religious belief, or are they just saying that they have a religious belief because they don't want to get a shot? And the law is fairly clear on this point. Essentially, you just have to take the employee's word for it. When they say they have a religious belief, they have a religious belief. The second question that this could raise is, what type of an accommodation do you have to give? I've already given some examples in our previous discussion about disability, but I wanted to flag that you don't have to give an accommodation if it would be an undue hardship. And so what does that mean? An undue hardship is something that would be too costly or burdensome. But there's going to be a lot that you want to consider when deciding whether it would be an undue hardship. For instance, how often do they interact with their coworkers? What type of accommodation are they requesting? What percentage of your workforce is already vaccinated? Have you reached some type of herd immunity in your workforce already? And again, I think I already mentioned this, but do they interact with the general public where you don't know what the vaccination status is? And then again, the same suggestions that I mentioned previously regarding, potential hypothetical accommodations would apply also in a religious context. Can the employee continue to work from home? Can they continue wearing PPE? Is there a way to modify the workspace? I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I think it's pretty rare that an employer is going to want to administer the vaccine to their employees. But just in the event that there's anyone here who is considering doing that, two things to flag. The EEOC has said that administering the COVID-19 vaccine to your employees is not a medical examination under the ADA. However, the pre-screening questions that you have to ask, including, do you have any allergies to vaccinations or other health-related questions, may implicate the ADA provisions on disability-related inquiries. There are a lot of rules about how and when medical examinations and disability-related inquiries can happen lawfully under the ADA. So if you are planning on providing the vaccine to your employees, you want to be extra careful that you don't run afoul of these rules. You probably want to work in close contact with your lawyer on the front end before you implement. Okay, and now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about risk. And I will caution everyone to heed the warning of Dr. Ian Malcolm from the 1990s cinema classic Jurassic Park. Just because you can do something doesn't always mean that you should. So a lot of what we already discussed about the religious and disability accommodations relates to your risk of litigation and employee claims. So I'm not going to go too much more into that. But in addition to the risk created for those types of accommodations, there's also a risk because of the types of vaccines that are currently available. As I mentioned at the beginning, the current vaccines that are being offered across the country are available only on an emergency use basis. And so that adds another layer of risk because they're not approved by the FDA through the normal process. I'm about to get a little bit into the weeds, so I'm going to ask you all to bear with me because I think it'll be an interesting conversation, but I'll try to keep it as much in layman's terms as possible. So the PrEP Act is a federal statute that provides liability immunity to anyone who manufactures, distributes, or prescribes a drug meant to combat a pandemic. So, Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson are all immunized under the PrEP Act. But what does that mean for the rest of us? Under the FDA Act, Federal Statute 21 United States Code 360 BBB-3, the Secretary of the Health and Human Services has discretion to authorize use of a vaccine on an emergency basis. And under that statute, the Secretary also has discretion to impose conditions on that emergency use. The statute itself lists a number of potential conditions that the Secretary may impose, one of which is that individuals to whom the approved drug is administered be informed of their option to accept or refuse administration of the product, and of the consequences, if any, of refusing administration. So interestingly, when the Secretary issued letters of authorization to Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, it did not actually impose that condition in the letters of authorization. However, there was a condition imposed that the providers have to give patients information consistent with the FDA issued fact sheets. And those fact sheets do include that language that the patient has to be informed of their option to accept or refuse. And so that raises the question, if the patient is informed of their option to accept or refuse, but their employer is requiring them to get a vaccine as a condition of employment, does that run afoul of federal law? And the answer at this point is, we don't know. Lorena, I tend to agree with Lorena. I think probably not. It seems unlikely, but it doesn't mean that there is no risk here. And in fact, some plaintiffs are already making hay out of this statute. The case cited here is one that we're watching very closely, Legarreta v. Donna Ana County. It's out of the District of New Mexico, was filed in 2021. In that case, some corrections officers are claiming that their employer is violating their rights because they're being required to get a vaccine through as a condition of their employment. And they're raising as their primary argument this emergency use authorization statute. So as I said, we're going to watch it very closely. It just adds an additional layer of risk. We haven't seen any cases raising this argument in Oregon, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And it raises the question of, I've heard reports that the Pfizer vaccine could be approved through the regular FDA approval process as early as this fall. And so one question I would ask is, does it make sense to mandate a vaccine on an emergency use authorization when we could soon have a regular FDA approval and less risk? So there's a few other considerations involving risk and employee claims if you do decide to go the mandatory vaccination route. In Boley's view, employees who get vaccinated during work time, during time they would ordinarily be working, they need to be paid for that time. And so, as I mentioned, the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine are both 2-dose shots. That means that you would have to pay your employees to get vaccinated for both of those shots. Additionally, if an employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine, that could potentially trigger the workers' compensation scheme. I think there's also a question if you are mandating that your employees get vaccinated and they do suffer, and somebody suffers an injury because of the vaccine. One question that raises for me is, well, could they argue that the injury was a deliberate injury, which would allow them to avoid the workers' compensation scheme directly, entirely, and then just sue you directly? So a few things to be aware of. In addition, if you have a unionized workforce, a vaccination policy like we've been discussing would be the subject of mandatory bargaining, including other collateral impacts of vaccination. So who pays for it, the working conditions for people who are unvaccinated, PPE and social distancing policies, if you're going to offer any incentives for vaccination. All of those would be subject of mandatory bargaining. And that's true for public and private sector unions. And it's not on the slide, but I did just want to briefly mention there is some proposed legislation that would make mandating a vaccine for employers illegal as in the Oregon legislature. Our government relations team has taken a look at this and thinks that basically the bill was introduced too late to be actually passed this session. So we're not terribly worried about that proposed legislation, but that doesn't mean it couldn't come up in a future session. So something we will keep an eye on. And lastly, we've talked about mandating vaccines, but there are alternatives to mandating vaccines. And mostly that will be done through offering employees incentives to get vaccinated instead of mandating that they get vaccinated. If you are going to offer incentives instead of making a mandatory vaccination policy, there's a few things to consider. Some examples include offering a cash bonus or extra paid time off for getting vaccinated. One thing you want to be cautious about is not offering so high of an incentive that it becomes coercive. So probably the $1 million lottery that Oregon is offering is not something that you would want to mimic in your workplace, assuming that you would have the means to do so. But a small bonus should be fine. You could pay for the employees' transportation to and from the vaccination site. That's another thing I've seen. But it's very important to mind the pay equity laws and make sure that you're not offering the incentive only to those who have been vaccinated, because that could amount to differential treatment if you don't offer the same incentive to employees who can't get the vaccine because of a disability or religious belief. And so some options there would be providing the bonus to, or the incentive to, people who are vaccinated and to those who request an exemption, or provide an incentive to your entire workforce once you hit a threshold vaccination rate. Those are just a couple of examples of ways that you could get creative with incentive programs. So that will conclude my presentation. It looks like I've gone a little bit over, so unfortunately there's no time for questions, but I will welcome questions by email. You can feel free to reach out to any of our L&E attorneys if you have questions about anything we've discussed so far. So I'm going to now introduce Haley Morrison, who's going to talk to you about telework and return to work.